and we will, but you see the connection anyway. So now let's look at the capital flows. I think where the connection may be a little less obvious than it is for migrations, but nonetheless is there. So we're going to be talking about financial flows in a world where you have globally integrated capital markets, as we are now and have been since the 70s. The argument is, well, first, obviously, I mean, capital inflow is going to finance a domestic savings shortfall in any economy in which the capital inflows take place. That is, their domestic investment requirements exceed those savings. If, for whatever reasons, capital inflows are shut down, if you don't have a global financial economy, then investment will have to contract to be equal to the domestic savings. But if you have a wide open or let her rip global financial capital market, then it's investment demand that will matter, and domestic savings, who cares? You can go to financial markets to get what you need. Okay, we know that demography can influence both investment and savings. That's why the debate gets a little more contentious, and you're looking at net impacts of demography. The investment side, you know, everybody agrees on that rapid population growth is going to drive up investment demand. More on that in a moment. We might fight over about how much, but we don't deny that it increases it. What we fight over is the savings side. And whether you believe kind of life cycle models and all that stuff. So I'm going to start with that. And let me start with Cole and Hoover, who wrote this very important and off-cited paper in, I forget, anybody remember? Ben, do you remember? Cole and Hoover? 1960, no, different Hoover. Not my president. Yeah, that's the same Hoover, right. Around 1959-60, as I recall, something like that. And he was using Pakistan as the example, these two guys. And it was based on what they coined as a dependency burden hypothesis. And this thesis has been beat up over time as, you know, smarter and more cleverer young people have done more slicker models on it and applied better data to it. But the simple insight hasn't changed. It's really powerful. And that is that the decline in child mortality and also perhaps rising fertility, might have a little blip in rising fertility, increases the dependent young. They're writing in 1960, right? They're looking backwards over the past 2 decades, and all they see is dependency burdens from the glut of children. And their view is, okay, these kids eat, but they don't perform any useful activity. And parents, of course, have to give up resources to feed these kids, taking it away from accumulation possibilities, savings possibilities. And therefore, domestic savings contracts unless the state taxes and spends its way to increase it. You know, they are standing around 1959-60, looking backwards, when Asia, the analysts are writing about Asia in gloomy terms. Haven't gotten into miracles yet, except for Japan. But haven't gotten to miracles yet. Growth rates are lousy, especially in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Philippines an exception, which is doing pretty well, thank you very much. Thanks to Cesar and others. the idea is when these kids graduate to being young adults and begin to age, you start to get a savings boom, which will tend to make it easier to finance the accumulations. Okay, well then when they all age, then you get in the low savings mode again, and you might get a gross slowdown. So why is it contentious? It's contentious because Cole and Hoover were focusing on savings and how the dependency burden may choke off savings, at least domestic savings. That was their focus, but what about investment demand? Well, after give these kids, 15, 20 years to become young adults, and now you have to build infrastructure to get them to work, roads and all that stuff, infrastructure to get them to work. You got to invest in machines to equip them at work, and also build houses for them as they leave their parents. And these are all what Mo Abramovitz and Simon Kuznets call population-sensitive investment. So it looks like you possibly, as this cohort of new children reach young adult age, like both investment and savings could start to rise. And then the issue will be, well, will it be a wash? I mean, will they be equal, or does one dominate? And it turns out that one dominates, that the savings correlation dominates, it appears. Okay, what you're going to find, or here stated as a hypothesis, but it will be confirmed, is that countries that are just starting a demographic transition, so they're demographically young, those will be ones that have high dependency rates in the Cole and Hoover rhetoric, in a demographic sense. They will also be dependent on foreign capital. They'll be absorbers of foreign capital from abroad, since their domestic savings fall short of their investment requirements. That's going to be the hypothesis. And then as you mature and you enter the phase where you have lots of adults who have aged to become adults, and actually older adults, then you're going to switch to capital export. And you'll graduate from being youth dependent to having youth dependency burdens, and graduate from being foreign capital dependent. To the extent that this creates capital flows between nations, the story sounds plausible, right? But what we don't know is about the magnitudes here. But to the extent that it's significant, we can see it in the data and so on, then it looks like between nations you might have an intergenerational transfer. The older nations, just because of demography, not because necessarily they're rich, will transfer to the younger nations, which are likely to be poor. It may also be that the rich-poor distinction also matters, but the demography will matter. Or so it is argued from this kind of thinking. Okay, so I said I was going to take the 4 examples to try to illustrate these to see whether empirically there's any oomph to this kind of economic hand-waving that I've been giving. So let me start with the migrations and start with 4 examples. So I'll start with the mass migrations before 1914. Okay, we're talking about 60 million immigrants moving overseas from Europe. The numbers since 1950 from the Third World have been much higher, but compared to the populations of that time, compared to the populations of Europe, those are extraordinarily dramatic out-migration rates from Europe. It starts, oddly enough, the out-migration starts from the richest nations, which are still poorer than the high-wage nations in the New World. So it starts off with English and Scots and Irish leaving to the Americas or to Australia and so on, because the poorer countries presumably can't invest in the move until conditions improve for them. And then the outmigration begins to drift further east and further south as the so-called new immigrants arrive on the American scene. So that's the form that it takes, and those are the kinds of magnitudes. Once this mass migration kind of starts in the 1840s, I indicated a few lectures ago, and then it rises dramatically. One nation will be part of it, and then another nation will be part of it, and then some will disappear from the sample, and then others will be added to it over time. But in terms of the aggregates, those are the rates of migration that are achieved by the two winners of the prize, which would be Italy and Ireland. And those are really dramatic outmigration rates. I don't know how it translates into Philippine migrations, outmigrations. The Philippines may be close to that. I haven't really made the comparison. But those are big by any standard. The European countries, all of them, until some of them are interrupted by World War I, which shuts down migration, and then the US imposes restrictions as we panic about in-migration and impose restrictions in the 1920s. So those latecomers to the outmigration have their outmigration stopped. But for those that are allowed to go through the cycle up to World War I, they typically do pass through what could be a life cycle. Starts off with very low outmigration, rise as they undergo an industrial revolution. The outmigration rate increases. What? As conditions improve at home? More leave? Hold on to that thought. Reaches a peak and then declines as these countries get more and more economically mature. They all go through that cycle like that one right there. So it starts off in, say, Italy, middle of the century, 1850. Very small outmigration rates, but then steeply rises for the typical country. And then it reaches a peak and then drops down the other side. Every country undergoes this pattern. No exceptions to that rule, unless some event occurs, like here drawn in 1915, that chops things off because of policy, war, and other events. But if it's allowed to undergo its change, it looks like that. Even in post-World War II, when all receiving countries in the EU, Australia, the US, etc., impose restrictions on migration, it's still true that sending countries undergo these life cycles. Conditions at home really matter. And demographic conditions is a large part of it. So will be the story. So how do you describe this movement in more precise terms? Well, here's a little diagram I like to use to describe it. And that is, these curves, these lines here, are EMs, immigrant migration functions. And the game starts off when the country is poor and pondering sending some of their sons and daughters abroad. And there it sits at that point where that's the low wage that exists in this economy. It's poor, has very low wage, very low living standards. And E0 is the out-migration rate, probably 0. Very small. Okay, then things start to happen. You get industrial revolutions, demographic transitions, things start to happen in this economy. And it does two things. One thing is it shifts outward that immigrant migration function. And we have to talk about what might be pushing that outwards. And demography will be part of it, right? The demographic transition increasing the number of individuals in the young adult age category, that's one powerful event that can shift it outwards.